Everyone knows the pilots who died. Everyone has heard the stories of the ones who never came back. But almost no one knows about the ones who lived. Young men trained for a single mission. Young men who were told that dying was their highest duty. Young men whose futures were already written for them. And then it all ended. What happens to a soldier trained to die when the war ends before he does? During the final years of World War II, Japan created a desperate strategy, a strategy born not from strength, but from collapse. They called it the Tokutai, the Special Attack Units. Young pilots, often barely trained, sometimes barely adults, were given an impossible order: use your aircraft as a weapon. But the world rarely mentions this truth. For every pilot who completed a suicide mission, many others never did. Some because of weather, some because their engines failed. Some were shot down before reaching their targets, and many simply because the war ended. This documentary is about them, the survivors no one talked about, and the lives they could never escape. Historians estimate that thousands of young men were trained for kamikaze missions, but only a fraction took off. An even smaller number reached their targets. Most survived, not because they refused, not because they escaped, but because fate decided differently. Their planes malfunctioned. Their missions were postponed. Their final orders never arrived. And then Japan surrendered. The war was over, but their struggle was just beginning. When Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, millions felt relief. But not everyone. For the kamikaze survivors, the feeling was something else: confusion, shame, fear. They were prepared to die. They had written farewell letters. Many had already said goodbye to their families. They believed they would never grow old, never build a life, never see peace. And suddenly, they were alive. But what does life mean when you were trained only for death? Post-war Japan transformed rapidly, attempting to rebuild not only cities, but identity. And the kamikaze survivors found themselves caught in a place with no home. There were three major reactions society had toward them. One, silence. Japan wanted to distance itself from the militarism that led it to war. Anything connected to that past became taboo. Survivors felt they could not speak. They hid their stories. Their memories became locked away. 2. Shame and guilt. Many survivors struggled with crushing guilt. They were alive, while friends their age, boys they trained with, were gone. They questioned their right to live. Some believed they had failed their duty. Some lived decades without telling their own families. 3. No support, no direction. Japan's post-war government had almost no resources, and society had no place for young men trained only for sacrifice. They had to reinvent themselves in a world that no longer wanted the men they were trained to be. Survivors faced challenges that were rarely documented. Many suffered from anxiety and nightmares, long before the world coined the term PTSD. Others lived in rural isolation, avoiding conversations about the war. Many struggled to find identity. What career suits a man who expected never to have one? Some became farmers, mechanics, teachers, trying to live ordinary lives while carrying extraordinary scars. These stories were rarely recorded, not because they weren't important, but because no one wanted to ask. But not all stories end in silence. Some survivors chose a different path. They found purpose by confronting the past, not hiding from it. A few wrote memoirs urging young people to understand the tragedy of war. Others became advocates for peace. Some spoke in schools, warning future generations about extremism, nationalism, and blind obedience. They transformed tragedy into education. Their voices became a bridge between the past and the peace Japan holds today. Decades later, Japan began re-examining the war with a more critical, more honest lens. Museums were built, not to glorify the kamikaze, but to teach what led young men to believe dying was their only purpose. Research expanded, documentation increased, and slowly, very slowly, the survivor stories surfaced. They weren't symbols of nationalism. They weren't heroes of death. They were human beings caught in a machinery far greater than themselves. Their lives remind us that war is not just a clash of nations, it is the destruction of futures. The kamikaze survivors teach a lesson rarely spoken. War doesn't end when the fighting stops. It lives inside the men and women who survived it. These pilots were not monsters, nor myths. They were teenagers, placed into an impossible situation, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what survival meant. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths, not to justify the past, but to understand its human cost. They were trained to die, but instead, they lived, and living, for them, was the heavier burden. Their silence shaped a generation. Their survival carried lessons the world still needs today. Lessons about blind loyalty, about the value of peace, about the human beings hidden behind history's darkest moments. This was the story of the kamikaze survivors, the men history tried to forget, but we shouldn't fade out. End.